When I first picked up this planer, it came with a machine stand and a fairly large motor. The seller told me that he had never seen the motor run. As far as he knew, the motor was bad. It wasn't going to work for me. But I decided to go ahead and break it all down, take a look at it, and see what it looked like. I decided pretty quickly in the tight quarters that I hate square nuts. No, not you, SpongeBob. The motor was impressively heavy. I checked the weight and it clocked in at 128.7 pounds, or 58.3 kilograms. It was a bit like trying to deadlift your wife when she was still at her girlfriend weight. Alright, we got this motor out of the stand. Let's clean up the plate a little bit, see if we can figure out what we've got here. Try to do this on camera. But it's a little too shaky. We're going to go to the still picture. Let's have a look here. We've got a Brown Brockmeyer B-line motor. Will run at either 110 or 220 volts, 2 horsepower. Nice. Single phase, 1750 RPMs. Shows that it will pull 16 amps at 220 volts. Well, that's beastie. I don't know how well the camera's going to pick this up, but yeah, it just squeaks and grinds all the way through the rotation. It's got that lovely nails on chalkboard kind of feeling. Alright, step one to get this motor broken down and ready for inspection is to get this pulley off. It was almost welded to the shaft. In stark contrast to the pulley, the motor's end bell retaining bolts came out smooth and easy. After I got the bolts removed from the motor, I went around very carefully with a light-duty pry bar and a hammer and just gently tapped along the seam between the motor's end housing and the main body. There was quite a bit of rust and corrosion around that seam, and I had already tried with a screwdriver just doing some gentle prying to pull it apart, and I had no success. So I found that the pry bar worked the best. After a little bit of gentle prying, it became pretty clear that the bearing that was seated inside of the motor's end housing was not going to come loose, and I would end up having to pull the entire armature and everything out of the motor in one go, which is what I ended up doing, and it worked okay, just not maybe the best way to pull the motor apart. You can see there where the motor's brush cover came off, but the inside of this motor is just packed full with stuff. You can see there that some little critter had obviously made its home inside this motor at some point. The bottom of it was packed full of pink fiberglass insulation, lots and lots and lots of wood flour, and some kind of white fluffy stuff, looked like maybe plant material of some kind. I spent a fair amount of time blowing the interior of this motor out. It was just completely packed full of wood dust and wood flour. Every time it felt like I had gotten every bit of it out of there, I'd hit another pocket somewhere and there'd be a cloud that got picked up. And I didn't want to leave any of this in the motor. It's pretty clear this motor had not been cleaned out or blown out on a regular basis, and I just didn't want to leave any of this garbage behind when I put it back together. As I was blowing out the inside of this motor, I kept finding little bits of metal. They almost looked like solder blobs, and I wasn't sure if maybe a mouse or something had dragged these into the motor from outside, or if this had come from somewhere inside the motor itself. I didn't find any obvious areas of damage or places where I could see that solder had come loose, so I'm assuming that this was brought in somehow. After I got all the goo out of the inside, took a brass bristle brush to the outside, knocked off most of the debris. Some of the rust came along with it, but got the exterior cleaned up. My intent was to paint it. I ended up wiping the whole thing down pretty carefully with some mineral spirits. There was like a film of oily, greasy dust on everything. So cleaned it up pretty good, got it ready for paint later. The brushes themselves are heavily worn. I'll definitely have to replace these. They're broken off on the end somehow. I didn't find any pieces of brushes inside the motor, and given how loose that brush holder was, I'm assuming somebody tried to take it apart, maybe to diagnose why the motor wouldn't run, and realized the brushes were shot. Quickest way to clean all of this like sticky, oily feeling wood dust off everything was just take it outside, spray it down with some engine degreaser, and hit it with a pressure washer. That worked pretty well. All the parts that I ended up pressure washing came out pretty clean. Didn't see any major physical problems with any no cracks, issues like that. So I think everything will come together all right. One thing that was kind of cool on the pulley after it got all cleaned off is that you can see the original Parks name on the pulley. Original Parks pulley of this planer. It's kind of cool. quantity of really old grease packed into the end of the motor. I'm assuming that probably somebody figured out that it wasn't turning correctly and squeaking quite a bit, and didn't realize that you can't just pump grease into the end of it when you're dealing with the sealed bearings that are inside this motor. One of the bearings was retained on the shaft with a spring clip, but it wasn't one of the spring clips that has the little ears on it that you can grab with a pair of snap ring pliers. You gotta have one of those special flat tipped set of pliers, and I don't have a pair of those, so I just pried it out with a pair of screwdrivers. To get the bearing off the end of that shaft, I just used the same puller I'd used before. This would not be the correct tool to use if you intended to keep the bearing, because this rides on the outer bearing race and you can damage the bearing when you pull it off. But I knew these bearings were shot. I was going to have to replace them anyway, so it just didn't matter. Now that I've got the bearings out and can actually spin them, they're full of shmoo. I'm definitely going to have to replace them. To clean up the shaft, I just used a little 4/0 steel wool and some lightweight oil. This would just clean off the corrosion, some of the rust, and some of the dried grease that was left behind. I didn't want to damage the commutation bars by using steel wool on them, so I just used a small square of maroon Scotch-Brite pad, and this worked really well to clean off all of the accumulated carbon that had built up over the years. Cleaned all the gunk out of the keyway, and there we go. Armature's all cleaned up, ready for reinstallation.